My name is Sharon Kyle, and this is my husband, Dick Price. And we live and work here in Mount Washington. I've lived in Mount Washington since 1994, 95.
Yeah, so we've been together 18 years. Initially, we lived together where I was living in Torrance. She was commuting to JPL, but she had a house already on Mavis Drive here in Mount Washington. So we moved up here, had a bedroom for my daughter. One time we were coming back from church, and my wife and my daughter liked to go to open houses. Me, not so much, but it was a beautiful Sunday afternoon coming back from church, and there was a bunch of signs, and I said, okay, well, what the heck, let's go drive up the hill. And we went over on this house on Crane Boulevard, and the sales agents were smart enough to lead us out onto this deck with this gorgeous view of Highland Park and Pasadena, and we put in an offer that night.
Yeah, so that was my plan. Of course, he didn't know that that was the plan. I go to open houses every chance I get, and I already knew about Crane, and I knew I wanted to live on Crane. And so that's where we've lived now since 2006. November 2006, we moved to Crane. So I've loved Mount Washington since the first time I saw Mount Washington. When I was looking to buy a place, I was a single woman, a single mom. I actually had 2 children that are now adults. But the real estate agent asked me, well, what kind of property are you interested in? And I knew I didn't have very much money. I loved hills. And so he says, have you ever heard of Mount Washington? And I had not. And I was living in the San Fernando Valley. I had worked for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where I worked for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory for 23 years. And he took me to Mount Washington, and the very, very first house I saw, I fell in love with. But I knew that you don't put in a bid on the first house. So 30 houses later, I ended up buying that first house. And I've always been politically active, engaged, but when I was a mother, being a mother, raising kids, and having a really demanding career didn't afford me the discretionary time to get as active in politics as I would have liked. However, I loved being in the Mount Washington community because it has an eclectic vibe. Lots of my neighbors and friends in this community are involved in progressive politics. Many work in the entertainment industry. But my experience in Mount Washington was such that even though I was very busy, I could get up early in the morning and go for a beautiful walk in these lovely trails, just right in my own neighborhood. Lots of birds and flowers and trees, and I love nature. And the first house I bought felt like a tree house. It was down in a canyon, and I would have, at any given point, raccoons or skunks or possums, all kinds of birds. There was an owl for months. An owl was nesting right outside of my daughter's window, and we'd hear him at night, and he was really loud. But it was just a wonderful environment to raise kids in.
I'm originally from Minnesota, and I've lived in New York City and Washington, D.C., but I've been out here since the 70s. And my LA experience has been Venice Beach, Manhattan Beach, Torrance. And then when we connected, and all those places were okay. I mean, they were just standard residential areas. Venice was kind of weird. But then when we connected 18 years ago, this was kind of like going back to Minnesota. I mean, I had not, when we met through online dating, and there's a whole story about that. But then when I saw it said she lives in Mount Washington, I said, well, shoot, she doesn't even live in the state. I mean, that's what I knew of Mount Washington. And then we got here, and it's really a kind of a paradise. And when you think about it, it's right in the middle of 20 million people. But if you don't look too far into the distance, it seems like you're way out in the country.
Yeah, it feels like
it just gives you a different sense of being. Like she said, going for walks and the animals and the terrain and the quiet neighborhood. I hope you don't distribute this video and anybody hears about it.
Yeah.
Let's just keep it to ourselves.
And the great thing, when we started dating, because it was online dating, and this was in the early 2000s, yes, this was shortly after 9/11. So I would never tell anyone that I was dating where I lived until I thought they were going to be cool. But I always figured if I go out on a date and we meet in a public place, if this person followed me home, I knew that I could easily give them the slip in Mount Washington and they would be lost. So I never worried about that. Initially, when we became a couple, we both knew that we had an interest in activism, and we found a Democratic club where he was living in the South Bay. So then we were looking for another Dem club in this area, in the Mount Washington area. And I was doing a Google search for Dem clubs in the area, and I could not find anything. And there is actually a very well-known, it's the Northeast Democratic Club that meets once a month in Highland Park. But they did not have a web presence. So you could do a Google search all day and all night. They didn't have a website. People knew about them through word of mouth. I did find out about them by going to the Los Angeles County Democratic Party. They had, if you're a Democrat and you want to get involved, and so they connected me to this Dem club. We went to a Dem club meeting. We joined the Dem club.
They were looking for somebody to take over the newsletter. And I'd been a magazine editor forever and could do newsletters. And she'd done newsletters for BAPAC, another organization, in the past. But we barely knew anybody in the club, and I thought, well, we'd just blow it off. But then I looked next to me, and her hand's in the air.
I was volunteering.
And so we started putting out an old-fashioned print newsletter, very nicely done because I had a lot of expertise in it. Won a statewide award. But as an adjunct to that, then she found a way to get a free website through the Democratic Party, through the California Democratic Council. And there was a guy named Henry Vandermeer who was helpful in setting the site up for the club. Now, both of us did things on the internet through our work, but we'd never run a site. And so we would post the articles we put in the newsletter.
Well, we didn't even know anything about HTML.
But, yeah. My punchline is, a few months into it, we were utterly thrilled when we got 1,000 visits in a month. 1,000 people looked at this article in a month. So we did that for a while, and we found out a couple of things. We knew we were into activism, we were into politics. We found out, I think, that we loved working together, and we had kind of different approaches and different skills, but we also saw that we didn't really want to be restricted to standard Democratic Party political line. Our interests were wider, or maybe somewhat different, and that was the genesis of LA Progressive. And initially we thought, at least I thought, that we were going to serve Highland Park, Mount Washington. And part of our impetus was that in one off-cycle election, 7% of the people turned out to vote. And we thought, this is crazy. This isn't even democracy. We need to get out there and spread the word. So I thought we were going to kind of serve the local community, which lasted, 6 hours into having a website. And then people from New York and Europe are reading the website. And we were off to the races.
Shortly thereafter, I would say the LA Progressive was being read definitely every state in the United States within the first 6 months of launching it. Learning how to rank high on Google so that when someone does a search for progressive politics in Los Angeles, the first thing that comes up on that Google search is going to be the LA Progressive. My goal was to make the LA Progressive the progressive paper of record for Southern California.
Because of who we are and what our interests are, we've focused on the centrality of race to try at best we can to bring black voices and brown voices more into the mainstream because they're typically overlooked. And in today's age, that's terribly critical. But 15 years ago, it was somewhat less so.
Well, the thing that's interesting about being married, being in this interracial, we don't even think of ourselves as being an interracial couple. The thing about race is Brian Stevenson is a civil rights attorney who he's written a book called Just Mercy, and a movie was made about his life, and it came out in 2019. Just Mercy is the name of the movie and the book. And Brian Stevenson talks about how proximity, being close in community, living, working, playing together, is really our only salvation if we're to deal with the racial chasms that exist in the United States. And I would say that in my personal experience, being married to Dick, I did have another husband. I mentioned that I had children when I first came to.
What?
I actually was married to someone else before, and I actually.
Oh, I thought those kids came
those
in the
kids,
mail.
No. So my first husband was a black man. And being married to Dick and being a part of his family really opened my eyes to a different kind of way of being. I would tell Dick, and these were just my own personal observations, so it's nothing I read about, this was all new to me. He and I would be someplace. Most of the time we were in spaces that were predominantly white, our church, our community, and whenever we'd be, let's say, in a social function, and the conversation touches on race. Everyone gets quiet and they all look at me. And this happens so often. And I'd say, Dick, clearly between the two of us, I'm the only one that belongs to a race. So, and I noticed that, when I'd have my family gatherings with my biological family, my mom, my dad, my brothers, cousins, and Dick would come. When you're around black people, we are talking about race. This is all the time because we're impacted, we're reminded. It's a constant drip, 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 drip. But then I go around Dick's family, and that's like, nobody here belongs to a race except you, Sharon, but nobody else. And so it was sort of an eye-opening experience, the way that I began to see that everybody's racialized except for white people. And so whenever we would talk about race in our publication, it seemed to me that for white people, they would look at it, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me because I clearly don't belong to a race. And I thought, Dick, how can we create, so what I wanted to do, and we've done it, and I think we've kind of been successful, is I've intentionally mixed in articles about domestic policy, foreign policy, race issues in the United States and abroad, but mix it all together so that someone who might come to the LA Progressive because they really are interested in the environment, well, they're going to be reading an article about the environment, also about what happens in the inner cities and how our inner city folk are exposed to all kinds of toxins and so on just because they're in the inner city, and how being black or being Latinx increases your exposure to toxins in a way that would never happen in these wonderful suburbs of the San Fernando Valley.
So this fact that we're kind of joined at the hip, we literally, we go by Dick and Sharon. So that's how people know us. And we travel around the city, and we'll go over to the west side, and unfortunately, oftentimes in these very progressive meetings, Sharon will be the only black person there. Then we get involved with the Black-Brown Clergy Coalition and LA Can, and I'm maybe one of the very few white people. Yeah. So a lot of places in the rest of the country think California is all this wonderful diversity, majority, minority state. But the fact is that we're still very segregated, and until we address that and do something about that, what's happening in the streets will continue. I don't know that obviously the gas will run out of the protests, but the hurt feelings underneath and the division. I think that is a core mission of what we're trying to do with LA Progressive, is bring different progressive voices together, especially across racial lines.
during this quarantine time, we live in such an ideal environment from a writing, publishing standpoint. It's beautiful where we live. We have a gorgeous view. I could actually stay in quarantine for years and I'd be okay. In a way, it's been nice because typically, so Dick and I are true activists in that we're out in the street. When Occupy was downtown Los Angeles, 4 out of 5 days of the week, we were down at the Occupy encampment. We're sitting down on the ground, and we're older people. And there were times when I said, oh boy, I know one thing, I can't sleep here because this concrete is killing my bones. But we have been extremely engaged, boots on the ground. And the quarantine has actually given us a little bit of a little vacation from doing it. Right, the day before we went into quarantine, we were engaged with an organization, LA Can, which is down in Skid Row. And we were planning on putting on for April 4th is the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And we were going to have a march in Skid Row in honor of, to honor him and to bring attention to how far we have not come. We're both on the board for the ACLU of Southern California. I'm also on the board for the ACLU National. And we help to run the ACLU local chapter, Pasadena Foothills chapter, which covers Mount Washington. So we frequently have meetings in our home here in Mount Washington. There's only one drawback about living in Mount Washington, and that's parking. Parking is definitely a problem. So aside from that, that's the only thing I'd say that causes us a little bit of a headache. I have no intention of ever living anywhere else. I believe that I sort of found a little bit of heaven right here in Mount Washington. Has been mentioned, it's sort of like Hollywood Hills. Some people say poor man's Hollywood Hills, but I think it's the kind of people that come here are people who are not so focused on making money. They're more focused on doing good work.
I wish it were more racially diverse than
Yes.
it is.
Yes.
It is, fortunately, we've got that handled at our house, but got to start somewhere.
And we've devoted our lives to disseminating information about social justice and volunteering with organizations who focus like the ACLU. And there are a lot of ACLU members that live in this community.
In Los Angeles, to the outside world, people think we're magnificently diverse. But we know if we live here that many of us go to church with our own race, go to work with our own race, socialize with our own race. And the thing you do about that is you have to make some conscious decisions to live differently. Now that's easy with us because we got diversity at home, but we choose to do some things on the west side with mostly white people. We go down to LA Can with mostly black people. And that's not...
And the Latinx community,
right.
And we do this with intention.
And it's not accidental. And so how, as they say these days, writ large, how do Angelenos solve some of that diversity? Well, you have to be making some decisions. You have to pay attention to who, if you're only associating with your own clan, then you're not going to understand anybody else.
And that's why I talk about the centrality of race. If progressives are really serious about wanting to create the kind of civilization, society, community that we want, you got to be intentional about desegregation.
Right.
That's the only way it's going to work, in my opinion.